Hello, friends. Thank you for joining me on this Thursday edition of the Daily Connection. We're still looking at the historical record of the kings of Israel and Judah. It's fascinating to see the parallel happening in the timeline there. You see phrases like, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, were juxtaposed in some cases with the king of Judah. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord. But what we see here, oftentimes featured, is how a king might be influenced. You would think a king to be the influencer, but oftentimes, just like any other human being, the kings of Israel and Judah would experience the influence of someone else, and it wouldn't be a good influence. It oftentimes would be a bad influence, one which would lead them away from the Lord. And so let's look at 2 Kings chapter 8 today. I want to start reading in verse 16. It says, in the 5th year of Israel's king Joram, son of Ahab, Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, became king of Judah, replacing his father. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done. For Ahab's daughter was his wife. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight. For the sake of his servant David, the Lord was unwilling to destroy Judah, since he had promised to give a lamp to David and his sons forever. All right, so when we think about the word influence, sometimes we think about person-to-person influence, but influence is all around us. We feel compelling forces, or we see, the idea of like gravity, for instance. I'm right now being influenced by gravity. If I was not, I wouldn't be seated. I would be floating off into space, for instance. Same is true with you. Sometimes we're influenced by temperature. The heat around us will cause the core temperature of our body to rise, or maybe we're influenced by activity. That influences our body, causes our heart rate to increase and blood flow to increase for the sake of producing, getting oxygen to our muscles and for function and things like that. Influence is all around us. But certainly one of the biggest ways we understand influence is by another person being influenced or influencing others. And that's exactly what we have going on here. Now, the Bible is clear that Jehoshaphat was not perfect, per se, in his way of following his Lord, but he did follow in the way of Asa, his father. He didn't go to the right or the left. He stayed in the middle of the will of the Lord. Although he didn't remove the high places, he didn't he didn't inspire ungodly activity. Now here his son, having been under his father and watched his father, you would think that Jehoshaphat would have influenced him for godliness and good. And yet we see here in verse 18, he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. Now, why would that be? He had seen what happened with them. He'd seen Ahab killed. He'd seen them defeated. Surely he had learned that by rejecting the word of God and acting in a way that was inconsistent with the nature and character of God, these kings had welcomed the judgment of God. But it says right there, he walked in the way of the kings of Israel as the house of Ahab had done, not as his father Jehoshaphat has done. And then comes the influence. Then comes the key. For Ahab's daughter was his wife. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Now this is a 32-year-old man, one who had been trained, one who had been, as much of his adulthood to this point, or all of his adulthood to this point, had been under the influence of his father Jehoshaphat. And yet, because of the influence of his wife, Ahab's daughter, which of course would not have been a good thing, but yet no doubt an arrangement made by Jehoshaphat with Ahab to maintain peace between the two nations. Now we see Joram being guided to a lifestyle that was inconsistent with the word of God, and it was in direct defiance to the will of God, hence bringing God's judgment. Notice it says he only reigned 8 years. That's a very brief time, not the most brief. There are others that will be certainly shorter, but that's a very brief time to reign, even for one of the kings of Israel or Judah. And we know that one of the primary reasons is because he did not walk in the ways of his father and did not walk in the ways of the Lord. He allowed his wife to influence him away from the word of God, away from the will of God, to embrace an ungodly, unrighteous lifestyle in worshiping false gods and bringing that influence on the people. And therefore, he brought judgment upon himself. But it's a reminder, and let's face it, I think most of us, our parents at some point warned us, hey, you better watch out for that kid. He or she, they're a bad influence. What do they mean? They're going to compel you. They're going to, persuade you to things that are not consistent with things that we approve of, to actions that are not consistent with, the character nature that we're desiring to be, and things of that time. And it's a reminder we have to be careful who we allow to influence us, what we allow to influence us. One thing's for sure, whatever you hang around a lot, whatever whatever you allow to be prominent in your life. I mean, such things as music. Music can be influential. Absolutely. We often think that it's just harmless, that our source of music that really doesn't affect us anyway, but that's just not true. Our source of media entertainment can influence us, positive or negative. Certainly, our friend groups, those that we allow to be in our inner circle, they can influence us, as well as us being an influencer. But right now, I'm focusing on those who influence us. And of course, our patterns that we put into place in our life, they can be influences, both for positive and for negative. What we have to do is we have to always evaluate. We have to always ask the question, how does this help me become more like Jesus? How does this help me carry on his work? And that's, of course, the definition of a disciple. Someone who's becoming more like Jesus and carrying on his work. How does this person in my life influence me to be better at those two things? How does this thing, this habit, this lifestyle pattern, how does that influence me in those areas? And that's the question we need to answer. And if it doesn't bring about a godly result in terms of who we're becoming more like Jesus and carrying on his work, then we should seriously evaluate that and be willing to separate ourselves from that and pursue that which will influence us to godliness. Well, I pray your week's been going well. I appreciate you staying in the Word for this godly influence. And also as a reminder, prepare yourself now. Make the commitment now. We're coming up on Sunday again. This happens to be a Father's Day Sunday when we want to recognize the influence that fathers have and grandfathers have on the generations that come during their time and after them. And so make sure that as you think about where you're going today, what you're going to be doing today, make sure that you have positive influences in your life. Make sure you're following patterns that are going to produce Christ-like results so that ultimately you'll be a greater disciple for Christ today than you were yesterday, and a greater disciple for Christ tomorrow than you were today. And this, of course, will eventually bring the blessings of God on that. Well, friends, love you. Pray your day is going well and your week goes well. Until we're together this coming Sunday, live sent.